Okay. Okay, cool. So in terms of the passage that I wanted to read today, I'm going to read a passage that I really thought about reading for my launch, but kind of perversely decided not to. This is the chapter 7, where Hugh Delgarno, our protagonist, has a memory of watching the family that lived next door, a Ukrainian Canadian family called the Howarchucks. And it's the closest thing in the whole book to like a contained story. It's the most self-contained thing that I wrote. It's probably the most narrative thing that I wrote. And so in certain ways, it's nice to kind of put your best foot forward. But again, at my launch, I was like, no, I'm going to give them weird lyrical stuff that's not narrative at all. But I thought this time around, it might be kind of nice, especially because it is something that might be a little funny and, might have, people might have good questions for me, hopefully. So that's the one I chose to read. However, in choosing to read this, I realized something that frightened me, which is that in order to do it, I need to do the great aunt's voice. The great aunt, like my mother and her parents and their parents all the way on back, is from the northeast of Scotland. And I wrote the great aunt in a way that tried to capture the syntax of people from that part of the world, but didn't really use the dialect, Doric. I didn't really use dialect words. I wanted it to be a little bit easier for people that aren't used to that language. So in reading this, I thought, okay, I'm going to try as best as I can, channeling my grandmother and my mother. But again, buyer beware, I guess. So I'm going to do my best. And I think it'll take me maybe about 30 minutes to read this. And then afterwards, people are warmly encouraged to ask me questions. So here we go. As I say, this is chapter 7. If you're reading along at home, it's page 54 of the print book. Not sure if it's the same in the ebook, I assume. Okay, here we go. Chapter 7. Yes. When I was a boy, my great aunt and I would stand on the balcony of the co-op apartment together and look into the windows of the neighbor's house. This was the house of the Howarchuk family, who, being at least nominally Ukrainian Orthodox, possessed a stance and a cultural inheritance on the question of voyeurism totally unknown to me. Perhaps they had no stance at all, other than not liking it done to them personally, which seems like a common enough stance in connection with many things in the world. They were a family of 3 round-headed boys, a short-haired, clerical-seeming mother, perhaps a school receptionist or a legal secretary, and a barrel-like father whose deep voice could be heard up and down the lane in the morning, saying hello to the other fathers as they picked up the mail and the paper. But he greeted the house-dwelling fathers more often than the co-op fathers, and never greeted my great uncle, being old, eccentric, and in Mr. Howarchuk's view, only tenuously and by fiat alone a father. We knew that Mr. Howarchuk thought this way because, in the few social settings where he would speak to us, he would tend to say something like, your son, your nephew, and shortly afterward excuse himself, most likely to watch hockey and fling out his arms in despair at the TV, as he was a Calgary Flames fan at a time when the team was so bad it was begging people to buy tickets. Which we of course saw him do, fling out his arms, Auntie and I. I cannot say that his hostility toward us prompted us to start spying on him and his family, nor can I say that the opposite was true. All I know is that it was Auntie's idea. In the early evenings, I liked to go out on the balcony and pretend I was on a ship, a castle tower, or something else I had lately been reading about. I was at the age when this play had acquired a kernel of self-consciousness that would shortly flower into full-bore shame. My great aunt would sometimes join me out there, very decently never drawing attention to what I was doing, to give me a cup of tea or teach me how to sweep away the dried cedar leaves that covered the balcony in a carpet of brittle auburn barbs. I often had to be retaught. One day in late February, as we swept together, She held a finger to her lips and pointed down into the kitchen window of the Howarchuck house. The twilight window was just beginning to glow yellow, making the interior of the room faintly visible to us from above. The middle boy, Brandon, something like that, was sitting at the circular kitchen table with an open Math 4 textbook. "He's at his maths," she whispered. "I wonder if the other boys are doing. Do they work as hard as he does in school? Fit do you think, Hugh?" In this way, my great aunt and I began to build a world, a Howarchuck world, a quilted world of rumor and speculation, true and untrue stories, conjectures formed from the snatches of evidence at the windows, the tools and toys lying half buried in the grass in the backyard. I had no consciousness that what we were doing was malicious, or could seem so, and so I watched them from the balcony shamelessly. Even though she was more than old enough to know better, my aunt watched shamelessly too. The Howarchuck world lasted the better part of the spring, long enough for us to memorize both the background and foreground rhythms of their lives, to feel in some way a part of them. We watched as the mother weeded, watered, pruned, and dug holes for seedlings in the vegetable garden on Mondays, the only day she had completely to herself. She worked the other weekdays, and on Saturdays and Sundays, the boys and their father were at home with their difficult and manifold demands. The thick, dirt-caked roots of the weeds would pile up around her like chicken legs or exhumed funereal lace, and I noticed she never wore gloves. This endeared her to me, perhaps because few little boys wear gloves while digging either. Sometimes she would stumble on a grass-covered metal tool or toy and swear under her breath before placing it back in the shed where her husband and sons were supposed to have kept it. Once she was finished, she would go inside, wash her hands for a long time in the kitchen sink, so long that she seemed to be praying, or sunk in a fugue from the warmth of the water. We assumed it was warm. We didn't know. Finally dry them, and then sit on the couch with her feet curled underneath her, reading the same paperback novel she had been working through for as long as Auntie and I had been watching. I too loved to read, but the day when I would be good enough to finish a book like that seemed very far away. From its sophisticated cover alone, I knew the words must be packed together in small type, many of them doubtless strange to me. I felt sure that even the ones I knew would relate scenes of subtle adult emotions I could not imagine, realms I was not ready to encounter because I was not yet sophisticated. Sophisticated is a word that working class and lower middle class children who grew up in Canada in the 1990s learned from advertisements for things that our families did not buy. The advertisements wanted us to feel that we should buy them someday, if we wanted the ease and protection enjoyed by the people in the ads. Correlation and causation. I never fully grasped what sophisticated meant, and so in my mind, it tended to bring up colors more than ideas. And the colors I saw in my mind when I heard the word sophisticated were just the same tawny and sandy colors I saw from far away on Mrs. Howarchuck's book cover. There was a craze in suburban Canadian restaurants and cafes of the 1990s for a pseudo-naive mural style in these colors. White aproned waiters and tall-hatted chefs and great swirls of coffee steam all stretched and pulled towards some random focal point up near the ceiling, perhaps with red steel girders or wrought iron balcony railings in the background. The time and place, some vague mid-century transatlantic dream. There used to be one in the bread garden. These murals, too, were sophisticated. And because the image on Mrs. Howarchuck's book was so far away, I was at liberty to imagine that it, too, was a sandy and tawny mural of waiters and girders and steam. I imagined as well, as children so often do, that the image on the front of the book was an accurate picture of the story inside, so that Mrs. Howarchuck was reading a book about waiters, who were, I believed, sophisticated people, and who might feel a secret love for a woman like her, not daring to tell her their secret as they filled and refilled her coffee in a room with a waiter mural of its own, the steam of the real coffee rising like the steam in the mural and forming an ethereal hand around her face, a hand so close to her cheek she could feel the warmth, this close, but never quite touching her. I admit I was in a kind of love with Mrs. Howarchuck, although I did not understand this at the time. I would have met any accusation of it with the strongest denials, not least because I was sure Mr. Howarchuck would beat me up without the slightest scruple about hitting the little boy. Mr. Howarchuck's stiffness toward us I have mentioned already, and his angry devotion to the terrible Pre-Aginla hitting his stride Calgary Flames. It struck me as important intelligence that Mrs. Howarchuck never joined him for any of the games. Perhaps because in addition to flinging his arms, he almost certainly yipped and barked at the screen in a way that I had seen some other Canadian fathers do when I played at the houses of my school friends. Whenever I was at the house of a school friend and this happened, an inner voice I barely knew the source of told me to find a pretext to go to another room. Here, the mother of the household would often be found, likewise waiting for it all to be over. If no such pretext existed, I would simply pretend to be seriously ill until one of my guardians came to collect me. As I got older, I would see that this was the essential truth of the country I lived in. A man on a couch, barking at a hockey fight, perhaps barking even more if the fight allowed him to play act some ethnic or sectarian grudge match. If the fighter on the other team was French and the father was Anglo, or Anglo and the father was French, or if the fighter was from Europe, or if the fighter was Black, or if the fighter was someone Don Cherry had insinuated was a pansy. While his son watched him warily from the corner of the room, and his wife and his son's effeminate school friend waited it out in the kitchen. What more could be said about this country than that? To what other end could its founding ideals? No, they never had ideals in this country, only myths. To what other end could its founding myths have ever led? But I am getting away from the story at hand. Yes, this is a story, I suppose. It is the first real story I thought of, both while I sat in the park and wherever it is I am now. And it might be the only one, unless the frame and the park are a story. But I tend to believe that they are instead a frame and a park. In any case, now that I have decided that this is a story, I feel certain obligations not to stray. If the way I looked at Mrs. Howarchuck was informed by the feelings and images that arose in me when I heard the word sophisticated, the way I looked at the boys was informed by the beginnings of the family-centered sitcoms that aired on syndication in the late 80s and early 90s. American shows like Full House, which I could not watch at home because we had only 3 channels. I only ever saw snatches of Full House and the other family sitcoms at other children's houses, usually when viewed in a desultory way by an older sister while my schoolmate and I built Lego on the living room floor. There was a way of introducing the characters at the start of these shows that seems difficult to credit now. I am not sure a comparable method could ever be used sincerely again. During the title sequence, each of the principals would get a little segment of 3 or 4 seconds meant to explain what they were like as a person. In the case of Full House, this meant we followed their expensive red car over the big bridge and into the dense-packed off-white city by the water where they were supposed to live, San Francisco on a gray day in wintertime, just like in The Conversation, only not really, and saw Stamos on a park bench with his guitar, Saget spot cleaning the windshield, Coulier gabbing on the waterfront. We then experienced a jarring switch to interior studio shots, where we saw the kids talking on the phone, throwing a frisbee for the dog, cracking wise, and doing ballet. We were supposed to know who they were now, a little. These people liked guitars, cleaning, gabbing, phoning, throwing, wisecracking, dancing. And yet, as I sorted Lego pieces on the floor with my school friend, I always felt a strange gulf between myself and these people I was now supposed to know. Their large, clean house, their evident money, their friendships with celebrities, their witty remarks for every occasion, their lack of any lasting pain. It was as though I were viewing propaganda from an alien culture, which I suppose in a sense I was. The culture of media class American comfort, which is alien even to most Americans. At the time, this was more of a feeling than a thought, and I tended to suppress the feeling. I assumed that the people who made television were better than me, and that they knew best. And so even if I somehow knew that the world of the American family sitcoms was an unreal world, I nevertheless began to look at my own real world with the expectation that things would mean in the same way. I was being trained to think of people as characters, defined by narrow sets of replicable actions and behaviors, and that to be a character was the fullest way to be real. Stamos plays, Saget cleans, Coulier gabs. In my mind, the Howard-Chuck sons seemed closer to being characters, and therefore real, than I was. I especially remember thinking this when Auntie and I watched them in the kitchen making pisanki eggs for Orthodox Easter, coming as usual a week after we observed it. And by observed, I mean that my great aunt would buy me a chocolate rabbit, and if prompted enough, my great uncle would very diffidently tell me the story of Jesus, who in his version was a well-intentioned but vain man who loved the poor, but told people he was the son of God because he was embarrassed to be the son of a carpenter. The villains were the Romans, who he always did the voices for, and their accents were always English. I remember thinking to myself as we watched the boys that the way each one behaved could be filmed for 2 or 3 seconds and used as the title sequence for a show called Howard-Chuck's World, a show that bored older sisters could watch while doing their homework in the family room. The middle boy, Brendan, Brian, was the only one who really knew what he was doing. The lines of his egg were as neat as the lines on an official playing field, if a little uninspired in the color department, and he blew out the yolk and white without a crack. He could almost be a knows what he is doing character, like Saget. But Bryson or Branson's dull competence bored me, and in any case, I knew he was unkind to the youngest boy, Michael, a year or so younger than me. He was always changing the rules on the fly when they played games in the yard, declaring in borrowed U11 soccer referee tones that Michael's goals were offside and didn't count. "I forgot to tell you that rule earlier," he would say. He could be a know-it-all character instead, a designation that sounds similar to knows what he is doing, but is not the same. Michael seemed more like a screws-up-a-lot character. Characters of this type fueled many of the sicklier episodes of the family shows. They would break something important by accident, hide the evidence, and cry. A character who knew what they were doing would comfort the character who screwed up with a long and boring speech. Then the studio audience would make the sound, "Oh." I hated these episodes and tried not to look at them as I played Lego. As a person, however, I could almost have liked Michael. He had a certain ambition. His egg was a tragic missed opportunity. He dyed it in color after rich color, saffron and crimson and navy and royal purple. And it would have been very beautiful if only he knew how to stop. By the end, it was an all-over blackcurrant, almost the exact shine and color of a beetle shell. The reason I could not like Michael was that he killed my melon. One day I saw him climb the high wooden wall that divided the Howard-Chuck backyard from the co-op's communal gardens, swing himself over, and land directly on top of the melon plant I bought with my own money at Plantland and had been desperate to keep alive. It never recovered, and some of the final vapors of my childhood belief in God were spent wondering if plants go to heaven. My guardians had been unable to console me with a speech. Halfway through the egg dyeing, the oldest boy, Joshua, came into the kitchen with his usual gangly insouciance. At best, he was a "they grow up so fast" character. At worst, he would be the cause of a very special episode about drugs. He took an egg from the bowl, dropped it without any preparation into the tub of blue dye from high enough that it splashed all over the table, and left again without wiping up, presumably expecting his mother or one of his brothers to do it, and also to fish out his egg when it was ready. Joshua was 13 or 14, but in my eyes already looked like a man, only more frightening than a man, as all teenage boys were to me then, and probably rude and rough. Transgressions I had gathered from my guardians were fatal. If not for other children, then certainly for me. I believed that if I ever tried to be rude or rough to someone, I would die. At this time in the mid-90s, white suburban Canadian teenage boys like Joshua wore big flannel shirts and torn up jeans with wallet chains hanging out the backs. I did not know that they were only wallet chains and attributed all manner of demonic uses to them. Strangling cats, maybe. When Auntie and I would go walking to Mr. Grewal's shop, we would sometimes pass teenagers in big groups hanging out in the parking lot outside, and I would be afraid. Auntie always seemed less so. Once, as 6 or 7 teenagers came along the sidewalk from the other direction, she told me not to worry because there's a girl with them, and sometimes they won't do anything so bad in front of a girl. She seemed to know what she was talking about, so I asked her if she knew why they had chains hanging out their pants. In Aberdeen and Maastricht, she said, boys would beat each other with chains, in gangs. Not all the gangs did that, mind, but some. There were so many gangs in Scotland. When your uncle and I went to see my people in Glasgow, we used to get our parcels knocked into our hands by a gang called the Billy Boys. They were Protestant, rough boys. They would leave you alone if they knew you were Protestant, but your uncle and I never wanted to give them the satisfaction. So we never told them we were, even though strictly speaking we were, and they knocked our parcels out of our hands. Yes, we were Protestant. Only, I think some of my people might not have been before. We think possibly some of my mother's people came over from Ireland to spin wool in the mills, and married Protestants, and converted for the marriage, or at any rate let their children be raised Protestants. Oh, and some of my people used to be wee frees. That's a kind of Protestant. But we were baptized in the kirk, uncle and I. Of course, we never went to church. If you want to know what we really believed then, we admired the Quakers more than anything. They sent penicillin to North Vietnam. But in a city like Glasgow or Belfast, it didn't matter if you went to church or not. It wasn't about that. Even a man like Mr. Grewal, if he lived in that part of Glasgow then, they would have wanted to know if he was a Catholic Sikh or a Protestant Sikh, meaning where did he live? Who did he work for, associate with, do business with, vote for, cheer for in the football? And where would he send his children to school? It was the same if you were Jewish, or if you were half orange and half green. You could never get away. There was another gang in Glasgow called the Conks, a Catholic gang. They were more rude than rough. They also wanted to know if we were Catholic or Protestant. So we said we were Protestants with Catholic politics, meaning we knew if it was happening to the Catholics was wrong. Getting passed over for good jobs and hooses there and in Belfast. We were all for a united Ireland, and we hated Rangers FC. Unless Aberdeen were playing, we cheered Celtic. Abdi hates Rangers in Aberdeen, and twice when the Orangemen tried to march, Everybody came out into the street to turn their backs on them. Your uncle and I are very proud of that. But the conks, they told us to prove we had Catholic politics by saying we'd do something rude to King Billy, something I can't tell you because you're too young. We didn't care about King Billy, and I hate to tell you that we thought what they said was funny. There was a flute and nothing. So we said we would do it, and we all had a laugh, and they didn't bother us anymore. But then back in Aberdeen, in Maastricht, in the 70s, there was a gang called the Gringo that didn't belong to any cause and bothered everybody. No, I didn't ken who they got that name. Your uncle thinks it was cowboys movies. They all wore jackets and had long hair like Mark Bolan, and they took drugs and started fights in the street with people they didn't know. And they would spit everywhere. There was no stopping them. Nothing you could say. All you could do was wait in the shops until they passed. They were one of the gangs who used chains. Auntie's stories never made me feel better as a child, but over the years I have tried to remember each one she told me as best as I can. This is how it goes with everything they gave me. And to hold and recount it all makes me feel better now. I have nothing solid else. All this to say that Joshua, the oldest boy, scared me. Scared me with his sharp elbows, his backwards cap, his love slightly ahead of the curve of terrible proto-nu metal bands that sounded like wailing souls in hell. We heard them all day from his open bedroom window, saw posters of scowling bald men on his walls. In the days when the Howarchucks kept their blinds open, that is. Because, of course, a moment came when my great aunt and I were caught watching them, and the Howarchuck world ended forever. I cannot exactly say when they noticed. They may have always quietly known, deep down, and only decided to act when the rattle and knock of that knowledge in the background of their lives became unbearable to them. All I know is that starting sometime in early June, the blinds of the Howarchuck windows would close practically all at once whenever my great aunt or I went out on the back balcony to sweep the cedar leaves. This had a powerful shaming effect all on its own, but I felt worse once the stories made it to school. At lunchtime, a couple of days after the Howarchucks started closing their blinds, Hubert Liu and I built a model of the Maginot Line out of rocks, moss, and twigs in a quiet part of the forest. Really just a stand of 20 or so big fir trees at the southeast corner of the school. We had read about the Maginot Line in the library the day before and solemnly pledged to make one of our own. Hubert was a Taiwanese boy who lived with his mother and brother. His father, a doctor, was in Taiwan. But, Hubert told me, this was not the same as divorce. Our friendship began because our first names were so similar and because we both had to field questions about where our fathers were. It deepened from shared temperaments, as in many ways we were like two little old men. Building a Maginot Line was a typical pastime for us. As Hubert placed twigs in the turrets at the correct intervals, and I worked on shaping the moss into embankments of the appropriate shape, we became aware of a third person standing over us. It was a boy a grade ahead, Braden or Bradley's grade, who always wore a puka shell necklace and short-sleeved button-up shirts with blue flames. I had gathered from the way that he skulked around the fringes of his grade's popular crowd that he was low in their pecking order, low but hoping to rise. Unlike Hubert and I, who had effectively opted out of the popularity game entirely. All he needed was one good scoop, a tale that would make him the center of eager questions from those who had paid him no mind before. He stood with his hands on his hips, looked into my eyes, and said, "You and your grandma are perverts." "My grandmother is in Scotland," I said. "She might be a pervert, but I don't know. She has dementia. She doesn't even send me a Christmas present." "Well, then who's that old lady you live with?" "That's my great aunt." "She can't be so great if she taught you to spy on your neighbors." "That's sick. I bet you saw them naked." Who told you that? I'm on Braden Howarchuk's soccer team. They all know. And now everyone's going to know in the whole school. I looked back down at my moss mound. Not long before, I had read about barrows, ancient artificial hills where kings and queens were buried with golden goblets and torques and swords. At that moment, I wanted nothing more than to lie under a giant moss pile of my own and be forgotten for the rest of time. I kept my head down and away from the puka boy, not wanting to give him the satisfaction, as my great aunt would have put it. But it did not matter what I did. Everyone was going to know about the Howarchuk world. Ha, you're crying, he said, and ran off to report the news to the people he so badly wanted to be his friends. Over the next few days, the story had evolved to the extent that classmates were asking me if my grandmother had taught me how to be gay. I did not know what to tell them. The school year was about to end, and I hoped that the months ahead would be enough time for everyone who had heard the story to turn their attention to other things. It was a long, dry, lonely summer. The parched cedar leaves dropped lazily onto the back balcony whenever there was even a slight breeze, but it no longer felt good to sweep them. Uncle did it instead. Hubert went back to Taiwan, as he always did over the vacation, and the few other demi-friends I had never returned my calls. Todd Longo from down the street came once, but as soon as he realized I had no video games, only soldiers, Meccano, and puzzles, he left early and never came by again. I took out every Calvin and Hobbes book at the library one after the other, and as many illustration-heavy history books as I could find. The grass on the lawns dried up. Malarial red worms of mosquito larvae twisted at the bottom of the co-op bird bath. We did not have air conditioning, and the heat lay heavy over every room. As always, we did not go away on vacation. The next September, Hubert ended up in another class, which by some unwritten social rule meant that we had to find new friends in our own classrooms. Those who had known about the Howarchuk world had forgotten the details, even the inaccurate ones. But something of the timbre or shade of that memory seemed to follow me into the new room, keeping me a strange and rather unwelcome presence in each of the social circles I tried to laugh at the jokes of, though I suppose it might have all been in my head. I do not know how to end this story, except to tell you that time passed. Bob Saget went back to working blue rooms. William Egan Colby died of atherosclerosis in his canoe. Some of the people who called me gay in elementary school are now evangelical Christians with several children. Some of the people who called me gay in elementary school are now writing on the internet that there should be zero tolerance for microaggressions. Michael Howarchuk, who killed my plant, appeared in a short CBC article about a research laboratory at the University of Winnipeg engaged in important AIDS research. He was interviewed in his capacity as a graduate student assisting with the project. He spoke with compassion about the stigma that continues to impede positive health outcomes for sufferers of the disease. I do not know what happened to his parents or his brothers. I can only imagine that in many respects, the characteristics I attributed to them were wrong. But I still believe his father was an asshole. I have not seen Hubert Liu since elementary school. In his Facebook profile picture, he looks happy. I hope he is happy. I learned that the baggy flannel trend taken up by the teenagers I feared so much had arguably been started by Kurt Cobain, one of the softest and gentlest men in the whole 90s alternative scene, and only because it was all he could afford as a teenager in Aberdeen, Washington. God is gay, he had spray painted on a police car in town, and he had meant this in a positive sense. Homosexual sex rules, he had written elsewhere. When asked by reporters from Rolling Stone what they thought of Kurt Cobain, two of his former classmates in Aberdeen had used the word. Cobain had attempted to learn about the origins of his family name by phoning people in the phone book with the similar sounding surname of Coburn. One Coburn woman he spoke to explained that the Coburns were originally from County Cork in Ireland. Cobain had visited Cork previously on tour and claimed to have felt an almost magical sense of connection to the place. The Cobains were not in fact from County Cork. They were Protestants from County Tyrone. Their ancestors were French Huguenots, originally named de Gaubienne, who came to Ireland in the 17th century. Much like the ancestors of Samuel Beckett, who were originally named Becket. An MP for East Belfast, an Orangeman named Edward de Cobain, was imprisoned in 1893 for sex acts with men. One day, in the book section of a value village where I often bought my clothes, I discovered the novel that Mrs. Howarchuk had been reading. It was Michael Ondaatje's In the Skin of a Lion. Okay, that's it. Thanks so much for listening, everybody. And if you would like to ask a question, please go ahead. You can type it in the chat. I'm very happy to answer. I have time. I put in the $21 or whatever it is for the good Zoom, so we're not going to be cut off. So please, by all means, if you have a question, go ahead and type it, and I would be delighted to answer. About the chapter, about the book.
I have a question, Geoffrey. It's Matthew.
Hey, Matt.
As long as I'm not butting in on anything in the chat.
No?
Why don't you answer the chat question first?
Oh, sure. Danny Krister asks, reading the book, I got a lot of Zeybald vibes. Any other prominent influences you felt while writing it? Yes, Zeybald, absolutely. Like for me, such an enabling writer, like someone who kind of pointed the way to a kind of writing that I wasn't sure was like allowed. Because I kind of came to this book from a past writing experience of trying to be a poet. And I still kind of, I think, approach things with the mentality of a poet, even though now I prefer to write in prose. And so with Zeybald, and especially The Rings of Saturn, which I think I first read when I was like 19 or 20, maybe 20. That was so like foundational for me, like to point the way. And I was, when I first read it, there was no way in my own mind, I was like, I can't write a book like this, but it at least showed me it was possible to try to write something that was not a novel in the conventional way. So Zeybald, absolutely, especially Rings of Saturn Zeybald, but I think for me, the number two that I really like is Vertigo. But also, let's see. I would say other people that really enabled me, Annie Dillard, her Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, and also her writing life, which those are technically actually nonfiction. Like if you look at them in a bookstore, they're usually categorized as nonfiction. But again, she writes with such a like, such a patience for like natural phenomena and stuff that also again showed me like, oh, you can do that in prose. And another one that I've been thinking about a lot because I was remembering this quotation in relation to this book when I was doing my posts for Open Book this month. Eugene Lim's Dear Cyborgs, which is a really short, really cool book that is, he describes it as a monologue fractal. So he has all of these characters that are like very purposefully not like realistic characters. They're just these sort of voices that ostensibly belong to these like superheroes. But a lot of their, you know, their origin stories and their backstories are so like improbable that we can tell he's just kind of having fun. And in an interview with Eugene Lim, he said, I'm going to try to quote it from memory. It's something like, I want to move away from character as a technology or something like that. And also away from plot as like a linear sort of design. And he was thinking instead about these characters' monologues and voices. And that really, again, also was like, oh, this is possible. Another one, huge, was Gerald Murnane, who's an Australian writer who I always kind of describe as like perhaps the strangest Australian who's ever lived in a wonderful way. Like he's never been in the sea. He has never been on an airplane. He almost never leaves the state of Victoria. He has this phrase that he uses in a lot of his writing that's mostly level grassy countryside. And it's almost like a motif for him that he keeps sort of coming back to, mostly level grassy countryside. And he says he's writing reports of the inside of his mind rather than like fictions in the sort of more conventional sense. And that too was like really enabling because it's like, oh, you can actually just write what's in your head, maybe. And he has characters that are sort of him and sort of not him. So he does have a lot of latitude within that. It's not always like, I guess, autofiction, quote unquote. But he's always doing that. And I really, I love that. And he has this attitude in general that it's very like strange, but also like unprepossessing. Someone called him a proletarian sage, which I mean, that's like life goals as far as I'm concerned. It's like a beautiful way to be, I think. And he is a guy who I think spent a lot of time essentially just teaching at a community college and then going home and standing up at an ironing board and writing these really strange things with a sense of like courage, I think, that he knew that perhaps no one would want this. So yeah, Murnane too is someone who really, I think, like enabled that. There's a couple other follow-up comments that people mentioned in the chat. Lavinia Chu said John Berger vibes, and I love that too. I really love Berger. To be honest, I haven't read any of his novels yet. I've read a lot of his criticism though, and seen a lot of his film projects that he did and interviews that he did. And again, there's this sort of like slow attention and deliberation that you see in Berger that I really appreciate. Berger is someone who had Marxist politics that he always wanted to communicate in a way that made sense to people. You see him as like this really, I think, generous educator. Like there's a great scene in his Ways of Seeing where he's getting children to look at, who is it again? I can't remember the painter now, but 17th century Italian painter, and asking them for their thoughts and whatever their sort of initial reactions are. He's like, you know, that's actually true. And so Berger is someone who I really like. It's like he found a way to be kind of simple. And I feel like that's a model for everyone, although I feel like the rest of us can't ever quite get to that. But yeah, definitely Berger. And Adam McPhee asks about parts of Falling Hour remind me of Mary Douglas's thinking in circles on the ring composition used to create symmetry, mostly in ancient poetry. Was there anything like that in your structuring of Falling Hour? It's a really great question. I have a weird sort of answer for this because I'm really bad at structure. I wrote this in a way where I was sort of like, okay, how can I allow myself to write something? And that meant I had to do modules sometimes, and sometimes even like out of sequence, or like I hadn't worked out the sequence. My outline, such as it was very sparse. But one thing that I have always really loved, and I think this might be something that Mary Douglas might also be thinking about in that book, is the sestina form. Like when I was a poet, it was my favorite form. And this is a form where you essentially have, if I remember right, 39 lines, and each stanza, except for the final line, is 6 lines. And in your first stanza, you have 6 end words. And those words that you end your first 6 lines with, like let's say your first line ends with tree, there's this complicated mathematical shuffling where like you have to do in the next stanza, I don't know, I can't remember now, but it's like the 3rd line goes first and then the 4th line, end word. So the lines are different, but the words are ending, or the lines are different, but they're ending on the same words, just shuffled in a different order. And I always loved that so much. And even though I was doing it in a way less like deliberate way, I think I was reassured by those forums when I was trying to do what I did, because there's sort of like motifs that people repeat a lot, either within chapters or like through the book. Like in this chapter, there's constantly the thing about being like rude and rough. Um, and in other chapters, there's things that Hugh says over and over, like it had not escaped me, or perhaps, or maybe, like they become these like repeated things. So I think I was like loosely, but also deeply inspired by those forms when I was writing the book. But yeah, as I say, in terms of actually structuring it, I wrote little modules that I would then have to like suture together in different ways. Sometimes a module was like half a chapter. So I knew I had two things I had to address in a chapter, and the chapters are more or less the same length. And so I'd have to kind of like find a way for them to flow into each other. And I still don't know how I managed to do that. It feels mostly like second thought, best thought, or something like that. But yeah, I feel like it wants to look like there's a more deliberate structure than there is. Matt, what was your question?
Hey, first of all, your Scottish accent is great. I love
Well, I mean,
listening to those parts.
I have a profound fear that a person from Scotland would say that's all over the place. That's simultaneously Perth and Moray, and But thank
Fair
you.
enough. It did the job. Yeah, I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about connecting the passage you just read to some of your posts as writer in residence. And
Oh yeah.
in particular, I think it was your third post. You talked about Chaplin and Roland Barthes. And I found it interesting that you said that reading a novel is not normally something we do in a big room together with a lot of other people all experiencing the same work of art. And then, of course, we're kind of doing that
That's
here.
true, actually. I forgot that that's a thing. When I wrote that, I think because that's a really good point. When I wrote that, I forgot that it is a possibility, both because I think I'm so like bashful that my instincts are always like, well, reading a novel is this like absolutely solitary experience, and it's never not that. But that's kind of wrong. I think that's really true that it can be shared like this.
Not catching you out on that. I'm
No,
just,
no, but it's true. I think it's a revealing omission on my part, and it says a lot about my bashfulness and like reluctance a lot of the time to have done this stuff in the past. But now that I do it, it's really nice. So maybe I should have.
my real question, I guess, is about like class consciousness
Yeah,
um, and yeah, how that plays in.
yeah, that's a great question for this chapter, because there's so much that's like I tried to make it a little bit subtle, but sometimes it's not. Like we're sort of meant to imagine that for context for people who haven't read the whole book, I had Hugh living in New Westminster, which is a suburb of Vancouver. And in my imagination, he lives in a co-op apartment, which in a Canadian context is like a form of rental housing where the tenants have a little more direct sort of rights. We should probably all really be living in co-op housing. You know, but in any case, they're living in a co-op, and next to them is the house of the Howarchuk family. And I do have Hugh say that Mr. Howarchuk is like he's mostly going to greet the house fathers, not the co-op fathers. So there's already this sort of sense of distance. And with Hugh's guardians, his great aunt and uncle, they're people who are working class Northeast Scots who came to Canada in the mid 70s, hoping things would get a little bit better. But it has essentially been a totally lateral move, or perhaps if anything, a little bit worse, because later in the book, we know that being a long distance truck driver has had some kind of physical or mental toll on the great uncle that isn't addressed in very much detail, and that's on purpose. But they're people that have this very particular view of the world, and it's a way of thinking about things that's really like based in speech and how you address people, and even like the modulations of it, which I think there's a lot of paradoxes in me writing the ant. She's the only person whose like dialogue I ever actually like wrote out. But there's a basic paradox that as I read it to you all, I actually did use some, in language we call them like reductions, shortenings that aren't really rendered in the text, right? I have her say Abdi for everybody, but in the text, if you read it, it says everybody. And this was my way of trying to show that what we're reading is like a sort of simulacrum, like a diet Doric, because Doric is the dialect, that we have to sort of imagine is there rather than actually see it there, which is also kind of what Louis Grassic Gibbon, who I talk about in my most recent post, it's something that he did and was very deliberate about, because he's writing in like the 1930s when, and I think for an English publisher, and he was conscious, like, I'm from the Northeast, this is my language, but if I write in it, an English editor is going to put a bunch of apostrophes on everything. It's going to sort of otherize it. So instead, I'm going to write sort of in English, but with Doric rhythms and some dialect words, so that he's sort of like creating a suggestion of it rather than actually doing it. And so, yeah, you're sort of meant to see that there is this like deeper history behind it, and behind everything the ant says. And I think also class consciousness in the sense that this idea of the character, which Hugh kind of apprehends through like watching television, is very alien to how he actually thinks of things. There's like characters are real, and if you're not a character, you're not real, right? And characters are people on commercials, people on TV, people who can enjoy consumer products, who speak a standard kind of English without a discernible accent. And there's a sense that like already we're feeling a kind of alienation from that. And like Hugh has this feeling, okay, well, the Howard-Chucks are characters, but I'm not a character. They're real, and I'm kind of not real. Does that begin to answer your question, Matt?
Definitely, yeah. I think the character question gets into another question.
Yeah, Brendan Campisi's question, which I think what I was just saying kind of leads directly into that. Brendan says the chapter does such a good job of capturing a child's perception of the world. Thank you so much for that. Can you say anything about how you approach that? I have a really distinct memory when I was about 3 or 4, when I went to preschool for the first time. I had this really like self-conscious sense of it was my first day. And I think the way that my mom was and the way that I was, I think my mom had probably really prepped me like to not be afraid, because I was a fearful child always. And my mom was really anxious that things turn out okay for me, but obviously there's only so much you can do. And I was her first child, and at the time an only child. And so we probably had talked about it before. And I think I went in expecting to have a terrible time. And I didn't have a terrible time, as far as I can remember. And I remember that at the end, they let us out to like run around and play on the swings and stuff. And when my mom came to get me, I was playing and I saw her and I said, and I even remember like that I almost like put on a voice, which is weird. Like I put on this sort of voice that I thought I should have. Maybe I heard a character on TV say it or something. As a person who is having fun. And I was like, look, mom, I'm playing, right? To reassure her, I think, in my mind, because it's like, I was self-aware in that moment. It's like, I'm playing, and we were so worried this wouldn't go well. And I got to reassure her in this moment. And I think like a lot of my childhood experiences, and like, it is very possible this can be chalked up to a kind of neurodivergence. I have the inattentive type of ADHD, and, you know, I think that might be part of the reason why I was always a little bit like kind of self-conscious about certain things. But anyway, a lot of the time as a kid, I was so aware of what was happening in this way that made everything kind of strange. There's this sort of alienation effect that I sort of, in a lot of my childhood memories, there's a memory of like, oh, well, we do this and here's why. And I was the kind of kid that always needed to like ask like why we did things. And my mom, like, again, really indulged me. She tried to explain, like, well, this is what's happening. Sometimes the explanations helped. Sometimes they made me more like terrified. Not her fault, but I think just like when you're a kid, you get an explanation. You're like, you know, like the first time I heard about eternity as a concept, I was like, oh, fuck. So I think I really wanted to lean into the sense of like observing everything from this perspective of it being really new, really strange, described for the first time like an alien would, or a sort of an anthropologist from another culture. Weirdly, I think children kind of are that in a way, like as they're learning what their own culture is telling them to do, there's sometimes this moment of pushback or like, why do we do this? Or like, and I think I tried to go back to that place. So like, why does he fling out his arms at the TV and scream at the hockey and like, and I think, yeah, that always seemed important to me. And I wanted Hugh to still kind of like have those characteristics. Yeah, I don't know. It satisfies me in a way to like write that way. There was, this is a strange reference, but there's like this Twitter account that posts about Heathcliff, which is a really strange newspaper cartoon about this cat, and it's very like surreal. It's sort of like Garfield on Laughing Gas or something. But someone had this really thoughtful like critique of Heathcliff as a comic where it's like basically all these strange things are happening and everything is sort of being narrated from observers. Like there's maybe two birds on a perch and they're watching Heathcliff do some strange thing. And they're not like, oh my, what's happening? They're sort of knowledgeably, they're like, well, it's garbage day. And that's why Heathcliff is like wearing a tuna sandwich or something, And for me, that was like really satisfying. Like there's this sense of you're explicating a culture, even though it's ostensibly kind of your culture and making it look really weird. And I think children are good at that. I think people who have a sense of affiliation with more than one culture through immigration or through their family's immigration stories or through class or through even regional differences, like linguistic differences, cultural differences. I think these things really make a person more like aware. And I just, yeah, I really wanted to lean into it and use it as much as I could. Thanks for that question. Anyone else have one? I should link the Heathcliff thing. It's really funny if I can find it. James Kelly, thank you. I need to go, sorry, as I'd like to hear more. I haven't had a chance to read your book yet, but after your great reading, Scott's Doric Accent and All, thank you. I'll hunt it down here in the UK. So just to say quickly, James, you should be able to get it from any bookstore that allows you to order books, and you probably won't have to pay shipping. I was lucky to be a student in the 1970s to be taught by Sebald. Oh my gosh. So I'm particularly interested to hear your appreciation for him. Well, James, I'm particularly interested to hear everything about Sebald from you. Please, if you have my Twitter or would like to tell me more, I'd love to hear more. And thanks to everyone for the great questions and Geoffrey's answers, which have made me further want to read the book. Well, thanks so much to James. Truly, I would be delighted to hear more. There's a book that I know exists called like Saturn's Moons or something like that. There was this sort of biographical retrospective of Sebald from a lot of people that knew him, including former students. And it seemed like really fun to read. And I loved reading about how he taught writing classes and stuff, because again, it seemed like he had a really generous way of doing things. Yeah, so truly, James, thank you very much. I really want to hear more about this sometime. Anybody else have a question for me? It has been an hour, so I am also totally understand if people need to go, but if anyone else has one, I'm happy to stick around. Brent says, thank you for the reading and Q&A, Geoffrey. I've got to hop off as well. Just picked it up from the Indigo on Granville yesterday, and I'm starting to read it today. Thank you so much, Brent. Sam and I have got our book club reading it this month. Brent and Sam are my trivia comrades. We go to trivia every week, pub trivia, and we had been winning for a while, but we've kind of been getting dusted a little bit last few weeks. Hopefully that turns around. Emery Brooks says, no question, just wanted to say, as a person who ruminates and spends a lot of time in my own head as an observer, I really appreciate the style of writing. I feel like I'm in his head, feeling his thoughts and emotions. That really makes me happy to hear, because I really felt like, I'm a ruminator as well, an attentive ADHD person. I felt like I had to write this way because anytime I tried to write another way, I couldn't get it to work. It's like holding an eel in your hands or something. You try to hold on to it and it's like, it's gone, I feel that way about narrative. I had to do it this way. I couldn't do it any other way. And so hearing from people who have maybe a similar inner cognitive experience in one way or another has been really gratifying. So thank you so much, Emery. Lavina Chu says, hi, Geoffrey, where should we keep an eye out for more info in terms of your reading at Type Books? Great question. I would like to share it on my Twitter as soon as I know. Again, it's not that far away. It's only about 2 weeks. So as soon as I have all of the details firmed up, I need to just sort of check in with some folks at Coach House. I will be able to share that on my Twitter and also my Instagram if you have my Instagram. I guess I should probably put, for people that don't have these things, my Twitter, writer Twitter is here. Twitter, whoops, let me message to everyone, sorry. Writer Twitter is here. Should have put that in my document. And then my Instagram is, hold on, gotta find it. It's something. This is like when I'm teaching and you have to like find a file and people are just like waiting expectantly and you're like, oh. Okay, Instagram handle is just at Geoffrey D. Morrison with periods in between all those things. And I will make sure that I announce all the details about the reading at that point. Again, I just need to sort of clear up some stuff with Coach House, and yeah, I'm excited about it. It's been a while since I've been in Toronto. I lived there for 2 years, but I haven't been back in ages. Yeah. Okay. I think I have time for one more question if anyone wants to ask one. Graham Stonehouse says, thanks for a wonderful reading, Geoffrey. Thank you so much, Graham. Adrian Biquez says, hi, Jeff, thanks for the reading. First time I experienced this for a book and I quite enjoyed it. Curious if there's another book or poem in the works. Great question. In terms of other stuff that I have on the go, I am still working on, technically I'm working on 2 long things, which is a bad idea, I think. But the one that's closer to being finished, I am probably like 2/3 of the way through. It is another novel. And when I say 2/3, that's probably also not totally true, because I feel like the closer you get to the end, the more you realize, oh no, I was not 2/3. I was actually slightly more than half. But I do have another book coming, and it is also written in this kind of ruminative style, circulatory, ambulatory style, whatever we want to call it. But it has UFOs in it, so it's a little different. I've been reading Mircea Codrescu's Solenoid recently, which is a book about living in Bucharest in the 70s and 80s and being a teacher. And it's sort of an inner narrative book, but also a kind of surreal, almost sci-fi book. And knowing that book exists has really reassured me that it's possible to do the sort of like long digressive prose, but with weird aliens and things. So I'm hoping I can pull it off, but I really can't say exactly when that's going to be. I'll only that hopefully sooner rather than later, but when, I don't know. Emery Brooks says, I can't wait to read the next book. I won't even need to read a blurb. It'll be an instant buy. Thank you so much, Emery. That's so kind. Okay, well, maybe it might be time for us to say goodbye. I might hop off the call and make my lunch, but I really do want to sincerely thank everyone for coming. It was so kind of you. Your questions were wonderful, really great questions that gave me a lot to think about. So once again, folks, thank you so very much. Hopefully we see each other again at some other reading, some other event. And again, truly just want to express my gratitude for you coming out on a Saturday, especially for people who are having a beautiful Saturday in whatever their climactic zone is. Thank you to those people. Yeah, truly, thank you very much. Hope everyone enjoys their weekends, and don't be a stranger, basically. Thanks so much, everybody.